was around 11 p.m. on the 21st of December, and the van's tires crunched over the snow which had settled on the ground. Shane drove slowly, the wipers moving side to side in an attempt to bat the falling snowflakes away from the windscreen as they traveled along Old Mill Lane. The road itself was a long stretch, flanked by what was mostly farmland, so given the location, the weather, and the fact it was just a few nights before Christmas, there were little to no other vehicles on the road. They had not long left a small town, which looked as pretty as a picture, with its old houses and the coating of snow which sat upon it. But it wasn't the greeting card view or a night of carol singing which had brought the four men out on such a cold winter night. Mickey sat in the back of the van, legs crossed, rubbing his gloved hands together, trying to create some warmth, a sickly feeling in his gut, caused by what he and the three other men had done. Mickey Lachlan wasn't a bad man, nor was he a crook, not really. His work boots, worn and split, still held the smell of factory oil, despite being pretty much useless now, which was just as Mickey felt after being laid off less than a month before. He'd spent the last month at home, watching his daughter, Ellie, grow wide-eyed at commercials for dolls accessories, and a kitchen playset, none of which he could afford. He was in the van because Shane, a longtime friend of the family, had called him, his voice crackling through the burner phone like static, promising quick cash and no one getting hurt in the process. Mickey didn't know if he believed him about the people getting hurt part, as the man had a tough reputation, but given that he hadn't managed to get as much as an interview since losing his job, there hadn't been much of a choice, as he couldn't bear waking up on Christmas morning and seeing a disappointed look on Ellie's face. Shane squinted to see where he was going. As the snowfall was growing heavier, he chewed the stub of a toothpick as he monitored the road. His bald head and heavy brow made him look like a man not to be messed with, which was fitting, with him being the kind of man who talked about survival of the fittest while bringing a crowbar down onto someone's head. He was not the kind of man Mickey enjoyed spending time around, and his wife, Marie, certainly wasn't happy about the night's arrangement. But as Mickey told her before leaving, needs must. In the passenger seat, Glenn, the largest, if not the brightest member of the group, sat picking dirt out his nails with a switchblade. Finally, sat in the back with Mickey was Tony, a small, wiry guy who didn't say too much, but when he did, Mickey had to admit it was kind of interesting. There seemed to be a lot going on in the man's head at all times. An overthinker was a trait that Mickey had bestowed upon him. "Now what do we have here?" Shane muttered, his voice cutting through the old van's dull heater drone. He passed on the brakes, and the van coasted to a stop at the side of the road. And as the two men in the back got to their feet and peered out of the passenger window, they saw what looked like to be a sprawling, two-story house which was dripping in Christmas lights. "No expense spared on the decorations," Shane said, "which means there will be no expense spared on the gifts under their tree." Mickey shifted uneasily, watching his breath in front of him. He was cold, tired, and just wanted to get paid and head home. "Don't you think we've taken enough already?" Mickey asked, but the question fell on deaf ears. "The house must have cost a fortune," Tony added, "which means they will most likely have a state-of-the-art security system and some big dogs protecting it." "You let me worry about that," Shane said with a wink. "The main thing I see is that even though the Christmas lights are on, the interior lights are pretty much off, and there's no cars on the drive. The house might look like a festive dream, but it gives me a very bad feeling," Tony said. At his words, Shane turned. "You a psychic?" "Not that I know of," Tony replied, "but I have gut feelings, and they are rarely ever wrong." "Well, I'm rarely ever wrong either," Shane replied, "and my gut tells me we need to make that the last stop of the night, so whose gut's right and whose gut's wrong?" Tony just shrugged and looked away. "I'll park a little closer, then we're heading in, and anyone who wants to get paid fully will join me. Anyone who stays in here, your money gets halved." This brought a tut from Tony and caused Mickey to put his head in his hands. Glenn just nodded. "In this world," Shane continued, "you have to take what you can get, because life ain't gonna bring you nothing. Life ain't gonna put a smile on your kids' faces come Christmas morning. That's your job. Life ain't gonna pay your rent or keep your heating on. That's your job too. But what life will do is continue to kick you in the balls over and over and over. So man the fuck up and take what's owed to you. Now stop whining and get your goddamn masks on." The four men moved in the shadows, their figures almost invisible beneath the increasingly heavy snow. The house loomed before them, all twinkling lights and candy cane trim. And after moving around the house and checking for any sign of life or cameras, Shane motioned for Glenn to go around the back, while the others followed him to the front door. "Don't leave any prints," Shane said calmly, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "And don't screw this up. We get in, we take anything of worth, and we get out." The crunch of Glenn's boots disappeared around the side of the house as Mickey watched Shane work the lock. It was an old trick, one he'd probably learned as a teenager knowing what Shane's father had been like, and it took less than a minute before the door clicked open. "Showtime," Shane whispered, then grinned at Mickey and Tony before pushing the door wide. Inside, the house was very warm and quiet, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and pine. A Christmas tree stood in the hallway, its branches heavy with ornaments and strands of golden ribbon. Beneath it, a sea of brightly wrapped gifts sparkled like treasure. "Jackpot," Shane whispered, already moving toward the tree. But Mickey stayed by the door, listening. Something didn't feel right. The silence wasn't empty. It felt watchful. He thought of Ellie, of her wide eyes and innocent smile. Then he started thinking about the children who might live in the house in which he stood, and imagined their sad, upset little faces when they returned home to find the presents they had been sat staring at for the last couple of weeks had been taken. He wondered if he'd crossed a line he couldn't come back from. "Let's go," Shane barked, shoving a handful of gifts into a bag. "We don't have all night. Mickey, you and Glenn cover the rooms down here. Me and Tony will head upstairs." But just as the words left his mouth, a sound cut through the silence, the soft creak of a floorboard above them. Tony froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Shane straightened, his eyes narrowing. "It's nothing." But the sound came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate step. "Someone's home," Mickey said. "It's an old house. They make noises," Shane snapped, but his voice had lost its edge a little. The group stood frozen in the glow of the Christmas lights, exchanging glances. After waiting a minute or two and hearing no further sounds, Shane barked his order. "Time to split up." His voice low but commanding. "Cover more ground. Take what you can carry, then meet back at the van once your bags are full." Tony glanced at Mickey, his eyes wide with unease, but said nothing. Glenn then appeared in the background. He looked to be eating something he'd no doubt picked up en route through the house. The big man barely seemed fazed by anything. "What's up?" he asked. "Nothing," Shane said, before the others could speak. "You and Mickey down here, fill your bag, and go back to the van." "I'll check this side, you do that side," Glenn said to Mickey before walking away and continuing to bite at the object in his hand. Shane rolled his eyes. "Just don't spend too much time eating in here, Glenn." Glenn ignored him, pushing through the double doors and disappearing inside. It was a dining room, and it was enormous. The centerpiece a long oak table set for a feast. Platters of roasted turkey, glistening ham, and thick-cut, heavily buttered bread sat untouched, as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. The fireplace roared at the end of the room, casting a cozy glow over the whole scene. But what truly caught Glenn's attention was the Christmas tree. It stood in the corner, towering over the room, its branches dripping with ornaments, tinsel, and lights. The star at its peak nearly grazed the ceiling, and beneath it, piles of presents stretched in every direction. "Now that's a tree," Glenn muttered, wiping a hand over his mouth as his stomach growled. He turned and made his way to the table, grabbing a turkey leg and tearing into it with a grunt of satisfaction. The grease glistened on his chin as he continued to stuff his mouth, his massive frame leaning over the table like a starving bear. When he'd eaten his fill, Glenn turned his attention to the tree. "This place is the jackpot," he muttered, pulling a black garbage bag from his pocket and shaking it open. He started grabbing gifts, big ones, small ones, boxes wrapped in glittering paper and tied with ribbons. He didn't care what they were. They all meant one thing to him: money. As he worked, he didn't notice the lights on the tree begin to flicker. The ornaments swayed ever so slightly, as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. Then the branches began to move. At first, it was subtle, a soft rustling, like the sound of wind through leaves. Glenn paused, frowning. He looked around the room, but all looked just as it had before. "Damn radiator," he grumbled, reaching for another gift. The branches moved again, this time curling inward, their tips brushing against his arm. Glenn froze, staring at the tree. "What the hell?" And he watched as the branches became still. He could hear only the crackling of the fire. But then, before he could react, the branches snapped forward, wrapping around his arms and legs with a speed that defied their size. Glenn let out a bellow, thrashing against the grip of the tree, but it was no use. The branches tightened, pulling him closer, their needles biting into his skin. "Shane? Mickey? Tony? Help!" Glenn roared, but his voice was swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. The tree's trunk split open, revealing a dark hollow at its center, and the branches dragged him toward it. He struggled, his muscles bulging, but the tree was relentless, and in just moments, Glenn was trapped, his massive frame cocooned in a web of branches and tinsel. Only his head remained visible, his face pale with terror. "Please, let me go," he begged, his voice breaking. "Please, I'll leave, The sound of tiny footsteps echoed through the room. From the shadows emerged a figure no taller than a child, dressed in red and green with a pointy hat. The little man moved with a sprightly bounce, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight. He hopped onto the table, kicking over a goblet of red wine as he went, and he watched Glenn for a moment.
Well, well,
the little man said, his voice high-pitched and mocking.
It looks like someone's been a naughty boy.
"Help me," Glenn pleaded, his voice raw. "I'm stuck. The tree. It's alive. Please." The elf tilted his head, considering him. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he pulled a small lighter from his pocket. It was shaped like a candy cane, painted in festive stripes.
"Help you?"
the elf said, clicking the lighter open. A small flame danced on the tip, reflected in his beady eyes.
"Oh, I think by the size of you, you've been helping yourself for years. You don't need mine."
Glenn's eyes widened as the elf lit a cigar, puffing a cloud of smoke into the air. The little man took a long drag.
"Merry Christmas, Glenister,"
the elf said with a grin, touching the tip of the cigar against the lowest branch. The tree caught instantly, its needles igniting in a blaze of golden fire. The flames raced up the branches, consuming the tinsel and ornaments in a hungry roar. Glenn screamed, his voice rising above the crackle of the fire as the heat licked at his skin. The elf watched, his grin never faltering, as the flames consumed the tree, and Glenn with it. The big man's scream soon faded, swallowed by the fire, until there was nothing left but ash and a faint smell of burning pine. The elf hopped down from the table, brushing soot from his hands.
"Last Christmas, I gave you my heart,"
he sang softly to himself as he disappeared back into the shadows. Tony moved silently through the bedroom, his breath catching every now and then as he registered the sheer wealth surrounding him. The room was massive, its vaulted ceiling glittering with a chandelier made of crystalline gold. The bed, draped in velvet and satin, looked big enough to sleep an army. Even the throw pillow screamed money. He ran a hand over the surface of a mahogany dressing table, smirking at his luck. The drawer slid open easily, revealing velvet-lined compartments stuffed with gold necklaces, rings, and delicate bracelets. Tony smiled, his thin fingers working quickly to stuff the treasures into his black bag. "Man, rich people got it too easy," he muttered, shoving a handful of diamond earrings into his pocket. A faint sound broke his concentration, a soft pitter-patter, like tiny footsteps on wood. Tony froze, his hand still buried in the drawer. His head snapped toward the door, but the hallway beyond was empty. "Shane?" he called, his voice little more than a whisper. No answer. The sound came again, this time closer. It seemed to come from beneath him. Tony crouched, lifting the edge of the bedskirt. Darkness stared back at him. His flashlight cast long shadows, revealing nothing but dust and shoes. He let out a shaky laugh and stood, brushing it off his nerves. That's when the first blade cut him. A sharp pain exploded in the back of his leg, and Tony cried out, collapsing to one knee. Blood soaked through his jeans almost instantly, pooling on the pristine white carpet. "Jesus Christ!" he shouted, twisting around. Out from the duvet of the bed bounced a small figure, no taller than his kneecap, dressed in green and red with a curled hat. Its face was twisted into a grotesque smile. In its tiny hands, it held a jagged blade, slick with Tony's blood. "Get away, you little shit!" Tony screamed, scrambling backward. But more emerged, 4 of them in total. They moved with eerie speed, their small blades catching the light as they darted toward him. "No! No!" Tony shouted, kicking wildly. He managed to catch one in the chest with his boot, sending it flying into the wall with a sickening crunch, but the others were too fast. Blades slashed at his arms, his thighs, his back. Each cut was small but precise, and the pain blurred together into a burning, all-consuming fire. Tony staggered to his feet, blood trailing behind him as he stumbled toward the door. He burst into the hallway, gasping for breath, the sound of the elves' high-pitched laughter echoing behind him. "Shane? Mickey?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Help me!" But the house didn't respond, and no replies came. Tony ran blindly, his boots slipping on the hardwood floor, slick with his own blood. He reached the staircase, gripping the banister for support, but as soon as his weight shifted onto the first step, the stairs flattened in an instant, transforming into a smooth, steep surface. Tony's feet flew out from under him, and he went tumbling, head over heels, screaming as he plummeted downward. At the bottom of the staircase, which had turned into little more than a slide, the floor opened like a giant yawning mouth. Tony shot down through the hole, landing with a bone-jarring thud onto a metal tray. The heat hit him first, an unbearable wave that pricked his skin and dried the blood on his clothes instantly. He looked up, his vision swimming, and realized where he was: a huge oven. Massive iron doors swung shut above him, sealing him inside. The walls glowed red-hot, and the smell of roasting meat filled the confined space. "Help me!" Tony bellowed, pounding on the doors, but his cries were drowned out by the roar of the flames. Outside the oven, elves gathered, their faces lit with twisted glee. One of them turned a massive dial using 2 hands, cranking the heat higher. Inside, Tony's screams grew weaker as his innards continued to bake. Soon, the cries of anguish stopped altogether. Shane moved through the house's upper right wing. He pushed open the door at the end of the corridor and stepped into a child's bedroom, or at least what looked like one. It was long and narrow, with 10 small beds lined up in 2 neat rows, each made up with identical red and green patchwork quilts. Stuffed animals and toys sat on the beds, their glass eyes staring at Shane as if watching his every move. The room had a sweetness to it, a kind of warm, nostalgic feeling that belonged in an old Christmas movie, but something about it made Shane's skin crawl. "Who the hell lives here?" he muttered under his breath, rummaging through a wooden chest at the foot of one of the beds. But it was filled with nothing but handmade dolls, wooden trains, and candy canes. Useless junk, he thought. Frustrated, Shane stood and moved towards a dresser near the far wall, yanking open its drawers. All he found were neatly folded children's-sized clothes, none of it worth stealing. His irritation mounted. "This is a waste of time," he growled, slamming a drawer shut. As he turned to leave, he paused. Something fell off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the air in the room seemed heavier now. The warmth had been replaced by a chilling stillness. Shane stepped back into the hallway, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his waistband. Then he saw it, standing at the far end of the hallway, its massive frame nearly scraping the ceiling, was a figure that didn't belong in any Christmas tale he'd ever heard. It was a hulking creature, cloaked in shadows, with curling horns that twisted out from its head. Its fur was dark, and its glowing red eyes locked onto Shane with a malevolent glee. Shane's breath hitched. "Mary, Mother of Christ!" The creature took a step forward, its hooves clicking against the wooden floor. It let out a low, guttural growl that caused the pictures on the wall to shake. He pulled his gun. "Stay where you are!" he barked. The creature roared, its voice a deep, resonant sound that shook the walls. Shane didn't hesitate. He fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature square in the chest, and did nothing. The beast didn't flinch. It simply let out a snort, its frown growing heavier, and Shane realized all he'd done was piss it off. "Oh, come on," Shane yelled, firing again and again, but the shots were useless. The creature advanced, each step deliberate, each growl louder than the last. Panicking, Shane turned and bolted back into the children's bedroom. He barely made it to the window before the creature's thundering hooves shook the floor behind him. With a desperate cry, Shane threw himself against the glass and felt it give under his weight. The icy wind hit him like a stone wall as he tumbled out onto the snow-covered lawn below. He landed hard, the snow breaking his fall, but still jarred his shoulder on impact. Shane scrambled to his feet, disorientated by the blizzard that had whipped him into a frenzy. The snow was blinding, a swirling white void that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Where's the van?" he muttered, spinning in place, his gun still in hand. "Where the fuck is the van?" The snow beneath his boots shifted unnaturally, and Shane stumbled forward. He glanced around, heart pounding, and realized the snowmen scattered across the lawn were moving. At first, it was subtle, the tilt of a head, the twist of a thick branched arm. Then they began to glide toward him, their cold eyes glinting with menace. "No!" Shane shouted, backing away. He fired his gun at the nearest snowman, the bullet passing harmlessly through his torso. The snowman surged forward. One swung its heavy arm, thudding into Shane's back, knocking him off balance. Another struck him in the chest, sending him sprawling into the snow, landing flat on his backside. "Get the hell off me, you snowman bastards!" he screamed, struggling to his feet, but the snowmen were relentless, swarming him, their cold, heavy bodies pinning him down. He thrashed and kicked, but they grabbed his arms and legs, their icy grips unyielding. Shane's screams turned to frantic pleas of panic as they began to pull. "Please, no!" The snowman continued to pull with unnatural strength, eventually ripping Shane's limbs from his body one by one, until all that remained was a torso with a head. A red stain began spreading across the white ground. Finally, one snowman freed Shane's head from his body, lifting it up and holding it high like a trophy. The snowstorm began to calm, the swirling winds settling into an eerie stillness. The snowman gathered around Shane's decapitated head before picking it up and pressing it onto a clumsily made body of his new snowman. They packed snow around it, then placed a crooked top hat on his head and shoved a pipe into his mouth. The snowmen stepped back to admire their work, their cold mouths twisting into grins. From somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of jingling bells came through the icy air. The snowmen glided slowly back to their original positions. Mickey's hands trembled as he slid a pair of silver candlesticks into his bag, his heart rate as high as it had ever been. The festive cheer of the house, the twinkling lights, the garlands, the snow-dusted windows felt utterly suffocating. It felt like a trap. His unease had grown into a gnawing dread, though he couldn't explain why. He picked up another gift-wrapped box, its shiny red paper reflecting the warm glow of the nearby fireplace. He then caught sight of his reflection, albeit a stretched, warped version. Mickey continued to stare at the gift. It looked so carefully wrapped, so deliberate, done with love, care, and attention, as though it had been waiting for someone far more deserving than him to unwrap it. His stomach churned. But he didn't have time to feel too guilty, as that was when he heard it, a low and guttural noise emanating from somewhere behind him. Mickey froze, every muscle in his body locking up. Slowly, he turned his head. The sound of his own breath had never seemed louder. From the shadows of the hallway, a figure stepped into view, its presence so overpowering it seemed to fill the entire space. The creature had the body of a beast, covered in coarse black fur, with curling horns that scraped against the ceiling. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Mickey, its lip pulled back into a snarl, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. "What in the name of Christ?" Mickey whispered, dropping the red box and stumbling backward. The thing roared, and Mickey ran. He darted down the hallway, his boots skidding on the polished wood floor. He reached for door handles as he passed room after room, but each one he tried was locked. The house seemed to conspire against him, funneling him deeper into its maze-like interior. The thudding of hooves followed him, growing louder and closer with every step. Come on, Mickey muttered desperately, his hands slick with sweat as he grabbed another door handle. Finally, it gave way, and he tumbled into the kitchen. The sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. The long dining table was laid with a grotesque feast. At its center lay Tony, or what was left of him, roasted to a golden brown and surrounded by bowls of mashed potato, roast vegetables, and glistening gravy. His lifeless eyes stared at nothing, his mouth stuffed with an apple, his nose missing. Around the table, the elves lounged into a bloated satisfaction, their tiny bodies sprawled across chairs and tabletops. Their eyes were closed, snores loud and rhythmic. Mickey's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. He staggered backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. A growl behind him snapped him out of his horror. Mickey turned to see the beast had entered the kitchen, its massive frame blocking the doorway, Its eyes seemed laser-focused on Mickey, and they burned with rage. With a strangled cry, Mickey bolted through the only other door in the room, his black bag long forgotten. The corridor beyond was narrow and dark, its walls seeming to close in on him. The sound of the beast's hooves echoed behind him, relentless and unyielding. His lungs burning, Mickey ran until the corridor opened up into a large room bathed in a warm golden light. He stumbled to a halt, panting, his eyes widening at the sight before him. At the far end of the room sat a huge, throne-like chair, carved from dark, rich wood and adorned with intricate gold designs. Its occupant was a massive figure, clad in deep crimson robes, trimmed with white fur. A long flowing beard as white as freshly fallen snow spilled down his chest. His face, though weathered, radiated a mix of warmth and stern authority. To his side, perched on a smaller, more elegant chair, sat a woman. Her petite frame was draped in a festive green dress. Her kind eyes sparkling, but her expression was unreadable. Mickey skidded to a stop, gasping for breath. His eyes darted from the imposing figure on the throne to the enormous fireplace behind him, its crackling flames casting a flickering glow across the room. Then came the sound of the hooves again, heavy and deliberate. Mickey turned to see the horned beast enter the room, his glowing red eyes locked not on Mickey, but on the man who had looked a lot like Santa Claus. Santa rose slowly from his throne, his movements calm but commanding. The room seemed to grow warmer, brighter, as he stood to his full height. "That's enough. You can leave now, brother," Santa said, his voice deep and rich. The beast, who Mickey had started to believe was Krampus himself, snarled, but seemed hesitant. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, Mickey thought the creature might charge anyway, but Santa's voice came again, firm and unyielding. "I said, that's enough." With a low growl, Krampus took a step back, his red eyes lingering on Mickey, who felt an icy shiver crawl up his spine. Then, without another sound, the beast turned and lumbered out of the room, his heavy hooves leaving scorched marks on the polished floor. Santa then shifted his gaze onto Mickey, who was still trembling and backing toward the nearest wall. "Sit," Santa said, his tone soft but leaving no room for argument. Mickey hesitated, then sank into a plush armchair near the fireplace. His knees bounced nervously, and his hands gripped the armrests, as if letting go might send him plummeting into some new nightmare. Santa returned to his throne. The woman, whom Mickey assumed was Mrs. Claus, still sat at his side, her expression still giving nothing away. "You've had quite the night, haven't you, Mickey?" the big man said, his eyes studying Mickey intently. Mickey's dry mouth opened, but no words came out. He nodded dumbly. Santa sighed, folding his hands in his lap. "I've been watching you and your friends. Do you know what you've done tonight?" Mickey swallowed hard. I didn't want to. He trailed off, his voice breaking. I got laid off. My little girl, Ellie, she doesn't have anything for Christmas. I didn't know what else to do. Shane said it would be easy, just quick, easy money. I didn't think." He broke off again, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. Santa regarded him for a long moment, his expression one of deep thought. Then he leaned back in his throne and began to stroke his beard. "Mickey," he said, "I understand desperation. I know what it's like to feel powerless, to want to give the people you love something more. But what you and your friends have done tonight goes far beyond desperation. You've stolen joy from others. You've deeply betrayed the spirit of Christmas." Mickey hung his head, his hand shaking. I know I screwed up, but please, it wasn't about greed. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, I'll do anything to make it better. I'm not a bad person. I'm really not." Santa's eyes softened, just a little, but his voice remained resolute. "I believe you, Mickey. I believe you're not like those with whom you arrived." Mickey's thoughts shifted to the others. "Are they all dead? The men I came with?" "They have all gotten what they deserve," Santa replied. "You've been lucky, as my brother Krampus would have torn you to shreds had he caught you. But this house was a test, and you all failed it the minute you took anything that remotely resembled a Christmas gift. There must be some sort of punishment for what you've done. It is my job to ensure that the damage to Christmas is limited. Mickey's face paled. Punishment? What does that mean exactly? Please, I'll make it right. I'll give everything back. The van is full of gifts. You can have them all back. Mrs. Claus leaned forward and spoke for the first time, her soft voice cutting through Mickey's panic. Oh, don't you worry, naughty boy. We've seen to it that the van is empty of all that does not belong to you. So, Mickey, I have a question for you before your fate is decided. Tell me, if you had one wish right now, what would it be? A nervous Mickey made to speak quickly, but Santa raised a thick finger. Take a moment to think. Mickey stood, trying to get his head around what was going on. Sat before him were Santa and his wife, and he was trapped in a house full of mythical creatures. He just witnessed a man he knew, cooked and mostly eaten on a large plate in the kitchen. Was he dreaming? If so, it was a hell of a realistic dream. He just wanted to wake up at home, with those he loved. I want to see my wife and daughter again. Mrs. Claus sat back and smiled, while Santa took a deep breath. He then held out a closed hand before slowly opening it. There was a glowing ball of light in his hand. Mickey watched it, transfixed, and then, in a swift movement that defied his size, Santa got to his feet and hurled the ball of light at the scared man in front of him. When Mickey opened his eyes, the world around him was dark and silent. He was lying on his back, and the familiar smell of motor oil and stale air hit his nose. He blinked, disorientated, realizing he was in the back of the van. His head ached, but apart from that, he felt okay. Shane? Tony? He called, his voice hoarse and weak. There was no response. The van was empty. Piles of stolen presents were gone, as were his companions. He sat up slowly, feeling a little groggy. Relief washed over him. He was alive, but as he shifted to stand, the world around him suddenly burst violently into life. The van lurched upwards. Mickey cried out as he was slammed back down, his ribs cracking against the hard metal floor. What the hell? He screamed, clutching his side. Before he could get his bearings, the van shook again, harder than before. He was thrown against the walls, his body flung around like a rag doll. His skull struck metal with a sickening crack, and pain exploded behind his eyes. Stop, he begged, blood pouring down his face from an open wound on his head. Please stop. The shaking stopped abruptly, leaving Mickey gasping and sprawled onto the floor. He tried to move, his limbs trembling, but his body was broken, bones shattered, muscles torn. The pain was unbearable, but at least the world seemed still. And then it started again. The van booked and twisted, slamming him into every surface. His screams filled the air, but there was no one to hear them. His vision blurred as his head cracked against the wall, blood pooling around him. Finally, the shaking ceased, and Mickey lay in a broken heap, barely alive. He slowly dragged himself toward the back doors, his nails scratching against the floor. With a desperate effort, he pulled down the handle and pushed the doors open, before tumbling out, only to be met with a blinding light. The ground beneath him wasn't snow, even though it looked as such. It was hard, like plastic. He looked up, his head spinning, and looking down at him was Ellie, but she looked huge, her face filling the sky, and she appeared to be at least 2 years older than she had before. Her face looked fascinated. It was then Mickey looked around him and realized he was in a lounge, but it wasn't his lounge, and the couch wasn't his couch, and the woman sat on it was indeed his wife. But the man sitting next to her with his arm around her certainly wasn't him. The awful truth then dawned on him. He was inside a snow globe, yet the glue or whatever was inside it did not affect him. He could breathe, he could feel, and he was in total agony. Ellie began giggling, her face full of innocent joy as she shook the snow globe violently in her little hands. Mickey's body was flung upward again, smashing against the inside of the glass. The fake snow swirled chaotically, mixing with the streaks of blood smeared across the surface. "Ellie!" he screamed. "Ellie, it's me! Stop!" But she couldn't hear him. To her, it was just a toy, a beautiful, magical little snow globe with a tiny figure inside. She shook it harder, laughing as she watched the snow dance. Inside, Mickey's world and body shattered, his screams lost to the walls of his little glass prison. Outside, Ellie smiled, placing the snow globe on her bedside table. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, her voice soft and full of wonder. Then she crawled into bed, leaving the globe to glimmer in the dim light of her room. Inside, Mickey lay motionless, trapped forever in a perfect winter wonderland.